Good evening. Welcome to all of you. This is, I believe, our fourth or fifth session of the Course in Miracles. And I believe it actually is the fifth. And we are going to talk a little bit tonight about relating theology to practice, because most of last week's session was involved with kind of the basic theology of A Course in Miracles. And so how does this relate to anything we might do in our daily lives? How does it relate to the practices that the Course enjoins on us? So let's start here with this. This is, shall we say, the upper level, the real world, and these are all terms that the Course uses. God created the real world, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of these features of the real world later on. And that's real, and this is the world created by the ego. When the Course uses the term the world, as opposed to the real world, it always refers to my complete recollection, it always refers to this kind of world the ego made. Now, this is the physical body world that we live in, the one that the body's eyes see, as the Course would put it. The black bar here is a kind of distinction between the real world and the fake world of the ego. Now, there are some practices in the workbook that tell you how to go about rising up, and it does literally use that term. And sometimes it refers to this bar as like a layer of clouds that, is apparently impenetrable, but you can go right through without any trouble. So that is the real versus the unreal. And you'll probably remember this famous verse in the Upanishads: lead us from the unreal to the real. Lead us from darkness to light, lead us from death to immortality. Notice again, we've got the same dichotomy, unreal and the real. This can be confusing because this word real has a different kind of connotation than it's being given in this mystical literature. The real has to do with thingness. The real in ordinary language is whatever you can see and feel and touch. And that's almost exactly the opposite of the way texts like this Upanishad and A Course in Miracles are referring to it. The unreal is basically anything impermanent, changing, and therefore unreliable. You see an echo of this idea going back as far as Plato. How can you say something is something when one day it is and the next day it isn't? It's only the unchanging and the permanent that has any real reality to it. So let's go back here. So we now have the way back. Notice the arrows are reversed. And here is us. And we seem to be submerged in this thing called the world. But as a matter of fact, this world is the creation of the ego, which is in fact something that we ourselves, in a sense, made up. So rather than being imprisoned by these things, it's merely a matter of dismissing false belief in them, and you go right up. Now, the two vehicles that are meant to kind of aid this are, the Holy Spirit, who is kind of the, shall we say, enactor of the atonement, and Jesus, who was the first human being, according to the Course, to fully accept his role in the atonement. So this is how you do it. The ego and the world are crossed out because their lack of substance and their lack of reality is acknowledged. And certainly in early stages of studying the Course, there is something that you're kind of basically telling yourself the stuff is, the world is unreal without really believing in it. Later, the more experience you have with it, the more it's going to be a bit like almost recognition. The snake and rope thing that I mentioned last time. So, you're actually seeing that, there's nothing really there. Now, there's, a huge amount of philosophical implications to this, and in many ways, a lot of the philosophies of both the East and the West have been trying to deal with some of the implications of this. Because, well, it sort of feels real, but in a way, it's not quite as solid as we thought. And somewhere or other, you can penetrate through it and thereby free yourself. At first, to the extent that you accept this, you accept it theoretically. To a greater extent, the further you go on, the more you tend to recognize it experientially. And this entails this, a rather stark statement. The world I see holds nothing that I want. Why? This is why. You do not really want the world you see. It's disappointed you. The homes you've built have never sheltered you. The roads you have made have led you nowhere. Nothing that you made but has the mark of death upon it. Again, this is a very stark statement, but it does really point out to a basic truth of the human condition, which is that there's some element of dissatisfaction in practically everything that we experience. If you want something very badly, I remember wanting certain toys very badly when I was a child, and I was very fixated on getting them, and if I did, which I usually did, everything would be fine, and I would enjoy the toy or not, but after a day or so, life would kind of go back to its ordinary, all too humdrum routine. And I think most people at least have experienced once, and maybe many times, this desire for something very, very intensely, and then only to get it and to find that, well, either you got it and, it's all very well, but it's not that satisfying, or this was a complete mistake. And a lot of the magical rituals were designed to enact one's desires, usually have this effect. I know a guy who a couple of years ago decided that he was going to do some kind of magical working to find a partner. And he did get involved with this woman, and I think he married her or came very close to marrying her, but it was a complete disaster. Later on, he kind of let go of it. He seems to have met someone more compatible. The lesson in that being sometimes the more you try to force something like that, the more it backfires on you, which is a principle that obtains in almost every sphere of life. But, as you know, no matter how grand your house is, it's still only a house. And the more you have vested in it, the more disappointment is likely to be found in it. Nothing you made but has the mark of death upon it. Now, that is to say, well, at the very least, anything visible and in this world is going to go, including, of course, the body. And for the Course, the body is kind of the ultimate symbol of limitation, of weakness and death, because it seems to be totally at the mercy of all sorts of forces over which it has no control whatsoever. Like, for example, disease, poverty, war, injustice, crime. You could fill in the rest of the list easily enough. The body is this extremely frail thing that you have to protect at all odds, against all odds, in order to continue to survive. And that is the thinking of the world. And that's the exact opposite of the Course's thinking, which is that the body is completely neutral. It was made by the ego as a way of kind of separating itself, the ego, from the rest of the world. But since what the ego makes has no reality to it, it's not that the body is sinful, it's simply that it's neutral. So if you use it properly, that is to say, along the lines of Course-related thinking, the body becomes, a perfectly serviceable instrument that you need not worry about particularly, that will you use, for the time being, for as long as you need to learn the lessons here that you're going to learn, and then it will just be gently set aside. So, and all of these things that we're talking about here, the homes, the roads, all of the, the clothes, all of it are, of course, to either adorn or protect or embellish the body. Is the Course puritanical? Well, I don't know. It's I don't know of anyone really who studies the Course who really, goes that kind of route with it. But I would say that, the more likely you are to, progress in the Course, the less likely you are to take worldly things a bit less seriously. And I'd say that would be the attitude to take toward it, them. That is to say, well, here they are, if you start fighting them, or if you're deciding they're evil, you'll just tie your mind up in further knots. And since there's no evil, because God did not create evil, because God did not create anything but good, these things are not evil. It's just a matter of sometimes putting a bit too much emphasis on them. And you'll see this echoed in the New Testament. This is a statement of Jesus's: "Be of good cheer, I have overcome the world." Now, this is from the Gospel of John, and the Gospel of John has this very, very powerful dichotomy in it throughout between I and the world. The I, you could say, is the true self, and the world is, the external kind of clog of circumstances that seem to surround it. In the world, the full line is, in the world you shall have tribulation, but be of good cheer, I have overcome the world. The I, in this sense, as it's being used in the Gospel of John, is not necessarily so much Jesus personally, but the I am principle within oneself. That seems to be at the mercy of the world, but if you change your orientation, in a sense it sits at the center, and the world kind of turns around it. And you see echoes of this in various places, including poetry, such as T.S. Eliot's line, at the still point of the turning world. If you're centered in the I, the world seems to turn around you. Is it going to stop? No, because the world is ceaselessly in motion. But you have less of an experience of being cast about on it or being victimized by it, and more of a sense of watching it go by in a certain tranquility and serenity. Now, as the Course points out, to say you really do not want the world you see, the world I see holds nothing that I want, left at that point is depressing. And you can think about it. I mean, there are many people who've actually reached this stage. They realize that the world is, in a sense, empty, and they become very disillusioned with it. And if they don't see anything beyond that, then you get into a kind of nihilism or despair, it's all rubbish, that kind of thing. That's a stage one reaches, probably not a stage to stay at any longer than you absolutely have to. But people get locked in this sometimes for entire lifetimes, as you've probably seen with people here and there. So going back to this, beyond this world, there is a world I want, which is the real world. That is to say, let's see if we can talk any more about it. The real world is not like this. There are no stories where people buy an endless list of things they do not need, no day that brightens and grows dim. There is no loss, nothing is there but shines and shines forever. And there is a certain amount of cognitive import in all of this. That is to say, the closer you get, the more your way of thinking and your way of seeing changes. Courses very often talks about seeing, and not in a metaphorical way. As I said earlier in a previous class, one of the lessons said, I will not use the body's eyes today. Kind of challenging in a way. But I suppose you could see it as meaning that, I'm not going to trust in this surface of physical reality as being, shall we say, ultimate or the boss of my life. It's the other way around. And the world outside you follows thought. Thought is the creative element, and the world shapes itself around these thoughts. Unfortunately, the world will do this whether you're or not you're conscious of this process. So if you're sunk in negativity, sunk in hostility, the world is more likely to shape itself to seem like that to you. It reminds me of the story of this woman apparently was a really, really terrible mother. And her kids got together and they put an obituary together for her when she died. There's really nothing we can say about her. She was just a really terrible, manipulative, awful person. When your own children say that about you after you're dead, maybe you have shown a bit too much negativity in your life. But you can certainly create it around you. Notice, and you can notice this, people do sometimes have an aura about them. And what that means is not necessarily, the kind of glowing band of light that surrounds people, which is, how the aura is often projected in New Age or Theosophical circles. But it's more of a feeling tone. There's a sense, like the old joke, when he comes into a room, it's as if somebody else left. Some people have this aura of just complete nullity. Some of them have this sense of, it's just depressing to be around this person. Others are brighter and more agreeable to be around. So as a result, one has to say that, these are the results of their thoughts, not necessarily of their conscious thoughts. The world does, in a way, manifest itself around your mind, but it also manifests itself around very deep levels of your mind. That split, going back to this, between the real world and the world of separation, is very, seems very decisive, but it isn't quite as decisive as we thought. That split bringing you down there. I mean, one split is that we all seem to be individuals. So, how do you go about this whole process? This chart you'll see is more or less like one of the previous ones. You have, shall we say, the agents of this process known as the atonement. The rising up through this false world that the ego made to the real world. And two principal methods that the Course offers are forgiveness and meditation. It doesn't use the word meditation all that often as I remember, but essentially that's what it calls for. It calls for basically resting in stillness, opening yourself up to the presence of God. It's a process of inner silence in which you can hear the voice for God. I would be cautious about concluding that this voice for God is going to be some little voice in your head. I think many people who do the Course go through this phase where they really think, I certainly did, where they think the voice of the Holy Spirit is going to be something kind of talking into your head. And if you go this route, you will very, very quickly find that you have voices in your head that will tell you just about anything. Where does this come from cognitively? Well, that's a long story. But no, the ego is the split mind. It's, in a sense, defined as the split mind. So if this mind is split, it's divided endlessly, and any sort of, it's a chaotic world, I think is one way that the Course refers to it. And, therefore, of course you're going to hear all sorts of voices, all sorts of conflicting voices in your head. That's not really going to be the voice of the Holy Spirit, which would be, which is completely clear and self-consistent and, has a real authority, whether or not it speaks to you in some kind of words or not. I think because of the fact that the Course was channeled in this way, where, a woman basically heard, as far as we can tell, this kind of internal dictation, many people tend to assume that, well, that's going to be the same way for them. But in my experience, it's not really so. And in fact, when, early on when I was studying the Course, kind of listening for inner voices and that sort, ended up becoming a very confusing and kind of counterproductive process. So I think a more useful process would be ask guidance after you go through the workbook, but and do the lessons there as best you can. But to go through the workbook and then in a sense ask for guidance and then follow your inner promptings. Eventually, you can tell the difference between your wiser inner promptings and your less wise ego promptings. I remember hearing in a Course in Miracles group many years ago, someone say that the ego always speaks first. And that's probably true to some extent because, particularly if you have some kind of negative thing in front of you, the first tendency is very often just kind of reactivity. And, when you get a nasty email, if you write one back, you would do very, very well to save it until the next day and see if it still seems like a good idea then, because the ego is very reactive. It's essentially unstable. Why? Because, well, it's not real, and B, because it's essentially division. So it has to be unstable just by the way it is, and that means it's easily threatened. So when you go through life feeling threatened all the time, bad things are about to happen all the time, well, that's the ego talking. And at some point or another, you're going to have to free yourself from it. It's a little harder today than it might have been in other times because TV screens are multiplying like bacteria, and there are very few places where they're not around. And many of these TV screens have news stations on them, which have the latest terrible, awful, ghastly happenings in, some unfortunate part of the world, near or far. Or, there's some helpful lady reading the latest health report telling you about how some object in your refrigerator, something in your refrigerator is a deadly poison that could give you cancer and so on. You've heard all these things. All of these things multiply fear. And it requires a great amount of discipline in daily life, especially to manage your exposure to that. And since you are very unlikely to be completely free of exposure to that, to see how you react to it and to manage that. That is all the ego. And that has to be set aside. Does this mean detachment from the world? Yeah, it does. It does mean detachment from the world, but not in the sense of running off and, living in the mountains or the desert somewhere. I mean, it's interesting. The stories of the earliest Christian monks were hermits in Egypt in the 3rd century AD. And what went on with them, they were even more tormented by the demons, that is to say their own inner demons, than they would have been if they were, back home in the city. So, there's no running away from yourself, as you've all heard. But how are you going to cope with it? One thing to keep in mind is that, as the Course emphasizes, nothing that increases fear is useful. So getting afraid of the ego, demonizing it, although in a sense it's the closest thing in this system to the devil, demonizing it is not really very helpful. It's kind of interesting because over the years I have in many Course in Miracles groups hear the question, should you love the ego? I guess my answer to that would basically be no. But because the ego is not, by definition, capable of reacting to love. It's the opposite of it. It is the denial of love. So I suppose you could love it and that would make it vanish, or you could not love it and bypass it and, through certain types of spiritual work, make it vanish or considerably reduce it in size. And this is possible. This happens. There are things to note along the way, and another one of which is that, as the Course says, in this whole process of purification, sometimes little things that once would never have bothered you seem much more irritating. So that there's always a certain amount of vigilance that's required. Certainly there's that workbook lesson that says, I will be vigilant only for God and His kingdom. Now, why forgiveness? Forgiveness is a very, very loaded term. It does not have the totally positive connotation that it's supposed to have. People are often quite dishonest with themselves about recognizing this. So it's useful to see that the Course's view of forgiveness is quite different from that of the world, not surprisingly. What is going on here? Well, forgiveness is about, essentially, if this is unreal, this never happened, then forgiveness is simply recognizing that fact. And it emphasizes over and over again, the Course does, that as you release yourself, you will perceive the world differently. You will perceive, shall we say, light behind the shadows. What does a person look like? Well, in this condition. Well, the Course talks every now and then about a rather mysterious thing it never really quite explains called the Great Rays, capitalized, R-A-Y-S. And it really doesn't talk very much about these at all, but it does say that they are, since manifestation of the true self. I think one way of experiencing this and under certain states of mind and certain states of consciousness is, you're surrounded by, there's this kind of enormous light, and the physical form of the person is like a rather dark little shadow standing in front of it. So again, it's the complete opposite of the way the world sees things, which is that the physical body is the only substantial thing. Some kind of glimpse of the real world, has the ego is kind of a dark, thin little film over some light. Another curious thing the Course says is that, if you are able, if you find yourself seeing objects with kind of little outlines of light around them, well, you were very close. Now, whether close means tomorrow or, lifetimes from now is another question. But those are some of the elements of what the forgiven world looks like. And the world, we're all adults here, I think. The world is not going to be fixed on its own terms. Saving the world, well, yeah, but a world that's really going to be saved is going to be a world that's completely different from the world we know now. So this world is not necessarily saved, it's transcended. This bothers people because it seems to lack compassion for all of the people who are kind of in, let's say you do go up all the way here. Well, does that mean, you just not bother with all these people who are still down there in the mire? Well, no, not really. But if you want to take that analogy seriously, if a guy is drowning in a pit of muck, you're jumping in and drowning with him is not really going to help him too much. You're making yourself suffer doesn't make other people suffer less. Now, this is, in a way, maybe a controversial point. The Course also talks a great deal about sacrifice, which it does not approve of. Why? Well, sacrifice is, in a sense, making a bargain with the world. You do give up things in giving up the world, but they're not real things. You're giving up, in a sense, a false belief. And so you're not giving up anything substantial. So it's not quite the same as, making a martyr of yourself. Remember that last week in the theology of the Course, I said that it refers to the crucifixion as the last useless journey, meaning that, according to the Course, it happened, but it was intended to show us that we have that death has no power over us, rather than as kind of the appeasement of an angry God, which is a sort of theology that really makes no sense. I mean, a great deal of conventional theology simply makes no sense. They do sometimes patch it up with, appeals to divine mystery and things we cannot know. But, and there are real, genuine divine mysteries. There are real things you cannot know, but there are also logical contradictions and absurdities. And, it's not really terribly honest with yourself or anyone else to try to pretend that one is the other. The Course, as I said, is at least logical and consistent in its teachings. If you grant its premises, everything follows, quite naturally and obviously. That's, a difference between the Course and conventional Christianity. What is forgiveness? Well, here's a line. To forgive is merely to remember only the loving thoughts you gave in the past and those that were given you. It is a selective memory. Why? Well, the loving thoughts you gave in the past are real because they're in line with the way God's love is. All the rest, which are out of line with the way God is, didn't really exist. And there's no point in bothering yourself about them. What about moral responsibility? What about, I guess I feel guilty about X, Y, and Z. The Course's answer is quite simple. If you choose once again, along the lines we're talking about here, you can leave the ego's errors to the Holy Spirit. What are the ego's errors? Well, of course, everything bad you've ever done or thought. These are simply errors of the ego. They're not sins. They're trivial mistakes. And it is definitely within the power of the Holy Spirit to clear them up without too much trouble. And that is an enormous relief, because people do feel guilty about bizarre things. And, some people feel guilty, about, some failing to send a Christmas card while forgetting that they've ruined someone else's life. Of course, would say, well, in a sense, both of those, however different they seem to be, are still the same problem, call for the same solution. Now, there's another line in the Course, it may even be the first line in the text. There is no order of difficulty in miracles. One is not harder or bigger than another. Why? Well, this reverses the world's thinking. That's why it talks about miracles, because if you go past the world's thinking, all of the world's concepts of difficulty, ease, impossibility start to recede in the background. Does this mean you can jump out of a 10th story window and the Holy Spirit will save you? No, I don't think so. But you can easily see that that's not really what it's talking about here. And to go a step further with it, forgiveness is a selective remembering based not on your selection. Be willing to forgive the Son of God, which is to say, every last other person in this world that you will see, for what he did not do. Because if this whole mess known as the separation, the fallen world, is of the ego, it's not real, it did not happen in a fundamental, shall we say, ontological sense, to use a big word, and therefore you needn't worry about it. The only thing you really need to do is to stop making the same mistake. And if you stop making the same mistake, which is summed up rapidly as the world's thinking, which is revenge, vengeance, mutual advantage, suspicion, that kind of thing. I mean, those are all mistakes. Don't make them anymore. Whether you come to that decision because of the Course or because of some other spiritual teaching is really quite immaterial. But eventually, I think one does have to come to this point in some way, no matter how you formulate it to yourself. And this takes us again. Forgiveness literally transforms vision and lets you see the real world, removing all illusions that had twisted your perception and fixed it on the past. A very early lesson in the workbook is I see only the past. And that is true in a number of ways. One is, if you look around whatever room you're in, I don't know, there are lamps here, microphones, all sorts of things. In a sense, you're not seeing these things as they are now. I'm talking about just ordinary physical objects, and the Course puts it this way as well. You're not really seeing these objects as they are. You're seeing a whole string of associations, learned responses to whatever lamps and microphones mean to you. Some of these are quite unconscious and even quite irrational, which explains phobias and that kind of thing. But it is, they're seeing the past. To really see something as it is in the present is maybe not quite as easy as one might think. It certainly requires setting aside a lot of mental baggage. I will say that the extent to which you can do this, things will look very, very different. And when I say things, even ordinary things. So it means a fixation on the past is a twisted perception. Now, of course, there are things that work at other levels as well, because all your grievances are of the past. What so-and-so said to you way back when, the horrible, ghastly things that people did to you, the phone calls they didn't return, their failure to notice you on the street, everything from big to small, are all grievances fixated on the past. And to the extent that you can just sweep them aside is the extent that you'll be free and happy. Now, I know some of you are familiar with this book of mine, The Deal, which does work with forgiveness. And although I don't use a great deal of the Course's theology in it, because it takes so much explaining, it essentially does say, well, just let go of your grievances. These things aren't doing you any good anyway. Why are you carrying around a 125-pound sack of garbage on your back? You could just let it go. So even in that practical sense, it's worth doing. But the Course would also say that literally holding grievances, being fixated on the past, imposes a kind of cognitive distortion that makes you see things upside down, topsy-turvy. You could say forgiveness is a refusal to see what never happened. If God didn't create it, it didn't happen. Now, I will go into this rather touchy little issue. These elements are taken from a thing called the Song of Prayer, which was channeled from the same source to Helen Schuckman. In newer editions of the Course, it's printed as an appendix. When it was printed independently, it was just a booklet of a few pages, but it's called the Song of Prayer. And it refers to, here's the phrase it uses, forgiveness to destroy. Now, things being what they are, forgiveness to destroy is relatively common, or really common. That is to say, your motives are not entirely clean. Sometimes they are, but sometimes they're not. And, a totally, shall we say, clean form of forgiveness would be just, a willingness to let the past go. A not so clean form would be, how about gracious lordliness? Where is this? There are forms in which a, quote, better person deigns to stoop to save a, quote, baser one from what it truly is. Forgiveness here rests on an attitude of gracious lordliness so far from love that arrogance could never be dislodged. Who could forgive and yet despise? This is all from the section here. And who can tell another he is steeped in sin and yet perceive him as the Son of God? a great deal of forgiveness is this kind of gracious lordliness. And I don't know about you, but I often, when I hear someone say, I forgive you, it's common enough to hear a certain kind of high-handed contempt buried somewhere in there. Of course, I forgive you, some kind of, as if you're like a medieval lord talking to a serf. And this, as it says, is arrogance, and it really doesn't have anything to do with forgiveness as such, in the true sense. Here's another good one. Shared sinfulness. Now, here's one person, this one here has got one person lording it over the other. Here is the kind of breastbeating where we all are wretched sinners. Now he says instead that here is one whose sinfulness he shares, since both have been unworthy and deserve the retribution of the wrath of God. This can appear to be a humble thought and may indeed induce a rivalry in sinfulness and guilt. It is not love for God's creation and the holiness that is his gift forever. There's a joke, it's a Jewish joke. These rabbis are praying in a study house, and they're kind of begging and groveling and saying, Lord, 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 help me, I'm unworthy. Help me, I'm unworthy. So while they're doing this, this poor beggar comes in, it's in some other corner of the prayer house, and starts saying, I'm unworthy, help me, Lord, I'm unworthy. And one of the rabbis says to the other, look who thinks he's unworthy. So, there's a great deal of kind of superiority in that. Martyrdom usually has some of these characteristics. Now, what the early Christian martyrs were on about is another story, assuming we can know that story or what was behind it, and I'm not 100% sure we can. But the martyr, today is, you make me suffer. Or we're both suffering in this together. We're both evil or wicked. Third is bargaining. I will forgive you if you meet my needs, for in your slavery is my release. Next line says, say this to anyone and you are a slave, and you will seek to rid yourself of guilt in further bargains, which can give no hope, but only greater pain and misery. This is basically what in my book, Conscious Love, I call transactional love. And most things that we call love are transactional in this way. To use the Course's term for it, this is the, shall we say, the genesis of the special relationship, as opposed to the holy relationship. You want something. You want to get something out of someone, but somehow this makes you both slaves. Ambrose Bierce was a 19th century American humorist who wrote a thing called The Devil's Dictionary with Sardonic Definitions. He defined marriage as a system of chattel slavery consisting of two masters, two servants, constituting all in all two people. Sorry, I got that wrong. Two masters and two slaves, all in all constituting two people. And, a lot of marriages are sort of like this, and obviously there are unhealthy ones and ones that are more likely to end. But the whole world of bargaining, human transactionality, it's of the ego. It just is. And there's a point at which it's just as well to recognize it, becoming indignant about it, or storming, a charge, leading a charge up a hill to end it. Right now, probably is not going to work. But we do have to at least see these things in ourselves. take the gift, for example. The gift. Well, what is a gift? You're giving it to someone and not expecting anything in return. Oh, really? In Christmas time, I don't think this is the way things operate. It doesn't operate in other times of the year either. Hey, I got her this really nice thing for her birthday, and she didn't even send me a card. That's bargaining. That's transactional love. Again, being indignant about it or becoming outraged or upset about it is not going to do anything or solve anything. But there is something to be said for recognizing it where it is, and at least seeing that there are other possibilities. All forms forgiveness takes that do not lead away from anger, condemnation, and comparisons of every kind are death. And there are a lot of forms that don't. Death is a funny word. In mystical literature, and I would include A Course in Miracles in that, it means the opposite often of what it means in the ordinary level. Life in the physical body is often characterized as death. That is to say, you are, as the poet Yeats said, fastened to a dying animal. And what we call death is a liberation from that. Of course, I don't really talk quite that way, but all of these things are death. And the Course's imagery is often really very stark and almost horror movie-like, because all of this stuff that we're going through is, if you look at it fairly objectively, is actually rather ghoulish. And the first thing to do is to, stare this madness in the face and see it for what it is, and then forgive it and go on and see, as I was saying earlier, the light that lies behind it all. So this is in a sense how we get from the theology, which I, in fairly abstract terms, set out last week, to actual practice. And what amounts to saying, well, nothing real can be threatened. Nothing unreal exists. Herein lies the peace of God. So I'm going to stop here. I'd be interested in any comments or thoughts, questions about any of this or anything else you have on your mind. The Song of Prayer, is it in the Course? It's not in the early editions of the Course. This one here, this is not too helpful because they all look the same. They all have this blue binding. Some of them are paperback, some of them are hardcover. But they all have this blue binding with more or less identical type on the cover. But if you look, and it says, I don't know if you can read this or not, but it does say A Course in Miracles combined volume. So here it has text, workbook, manual for teachers, clarifications of terms, supplements, and this kind of is what characterizes supplements. One is called the Song of Prayer. Again, these are very short. These were published as booklets for a long time. The other is called Psychotherapy, Purpose, Process, and Practice. And of course, it's to be remembered that the people who worked to ascribe, as they say, the course, were both psychologists. So this was, a bit of a somewhat more clinical look at all of this. It's not so clinical that you can't understand it, but, how do you, treat other people in a healing sort of way? Because, all you have to do is look back on, what I just said in the last hour, and, how do you explain this to somebody? I mean, I can explain it to you because, A, you're interested, B, there's been a little bit of a preliminary. But if you go around just telling people, the world is unreal, sin is unreal, all that kind of thing, they're either going to laugh or get upset. So you have to work, shall we say, subtly. And if you're a therapist working with a client, I would imagine you'd have to work equally subtly. Because, of course, if your therapist is working, you have therapists working with a client, you have every reason to assume that, there's something wrong with the client. Otherwise you wouldn't be here. So to take this a little further, whatever leads away from fear, in the Course's eyes, is healthy. And that's why the Course says, well, they don't really tell you to, give up medicine, conventional, pharmaceutical medicine and so on. And that's between you and your own inner guidance. At times, these can be useful, even though, as medical science itself is starting to discover, these are placebos to a greater extent than people had believed. But, you want to basically have a certain gentleness of attitude and a certain discrimination, how much of this you want to talk about with someone who may not have the slightest interest or belief in it. Someone sent me an email, someone in this class sent me an email saying, are study groups useful? And I said, yeah. I think they are useful because you are looking at an orientation that's very, very different from consensus reality. And if you have absolutely nobody else to share this with, it can be very difficult and very lonely. Even as it is, you can't go around explaining the Course. At least I don't choose to do that. Go around explaining Course ideas to everybody, as a way of, converting them. So, it's just sometimes, the best you can do is just not let the fear go any further. Story about Krishnamurti. He was sitting with a friend, and they were watching a TV show about, and it turned out they were watching a news show, and it was about a man that they both knew who had gotten arrested and committed a crime. And the other man was about to say, make some comment about it, and Krishnamurti stopped him and said, don't say anything, just say poor chap and leave it at that. The rest just leads to evil. What did he mean by that? Well, going back to the traditional definition of the devil, the evil is the accuser. You can go on and start judging people about, I don't know, right or wrong. This person did this person was really no good. From your own point of view, you're better just letting it go and not dwelling on it. I think that's what Krishnamurti was trying to say. So, anyone else? Okay, well, it's time. And next week, I believe, is President's Day, which is another day off. So I think it will be our last class that we'll meet 2 weeks from tonight, February 22nd. So that will be here on the same channel, so to speak. Very good. Well, thanks a lot. Have a great President's Day, whatever one does for President's Day, and see you in a couple of weeks.